So hello everyone. So today's mini lecture is for session 3.1 and it's entitled The Process of Organizational Change.
So today we're going to be looking at how organizational consultants, for example, try to analyze an organization and how do we create change? How do we have a process that begins to create change within the organization? And just to bring you back, a few days ago, we looked at some models for organizational change. One of these models is what we call the action research cycle, the action research model. And we can see that when you identify a problem, usually it comes from data gathering. So you look at the data available within the organization, and we can do interviews, etc., and determine what we call a preliminary diagnosis. And that diagnosis is usually discussed with the client. And then together with the client, you come up with an agreement of what we think is the source of the problem within the organization. So that's why I'm bringing this model back, is to show you that most models will begin with a diagnosis. So what a diagnosis is the process of understanding how the organization is functioning. And again, as I said, it's usually a joint process with the OD practitioner and the client to identify the focus of the issue or problem. What's important to note here is when we do a diagnosis, it should be a very scientific analysis looking at data. So we don't just use our gut feel, but we actually have to visit the organization and try to figure out what's happening using information from the employees, or even what we call unobtrusive methods by looking at the data that's available. And I'll go into that in a little while. So when you guys are doing your case study, and by now you should have been assigned a case study, have a read on it. And then one of the first things you need to do is start to identify what we call symptoms. What are symptoms? Symptoms are facts from the case that signify that there is a big problem within the organization. Now, I liken the symptoms and root causes to something what a doctor does, something like what the doctor does, and that is before he gives you medicine, he may, when you visit the doctor, he may have a look at you and ask you, so how do you feel? You know, what are the symptoms that you're feeling? So you could have a runny nose, you could have a sore throat, you could have a fever. And from those, he might even ask you to do some tests, some diagnostic tests, like a blood test or a swab up your nose or in your mouth. And hopefully you don't have COVID-19. But basically, if a doctor finds from all the information that he's gathered is that his diagnosis might be, okay, you have a problem, and that is you could have a virus. And that's what we mean by a root cause. The virus is what causes all these symptoms. So the doctor, when he gives you medicine, usually the medicine is not to treat your symptoms. He doesn't give you medicine to basically stop your runny nose, or although sometimes they do that, they give medicine to fix your sore throat. But if your sore throat is coming from a bigger problem, and such as an infection, then he has to treat the infection. And the way he might do that is give you antibiotics to deal with the infection if it's a bacterial infection. If it's a virus, then perhaps some other antivirus drugs might be used to treat that problem. So you can see how important it is to be able to identify what the root cause is. Because if you're simply treating the symptoms might come back. So it doesn't really solve the problem. Same thing in an organization. An OD consultant will have a look and try to figure out what the root causes are of a problem. So in your case study, try to play the doctor, try to figure out, not from the symptoms, of course you identify what those symptoms are, but ask yourself, what is causing these symptoms? An example of a symptom is there might be some conflict between the teams. There might be fighting. There might be some arguments going on, or somebody might say, an employee might say, "Well, I'm not very satisfied with the situation right now. I feel demoralized." So when you get symptoms like that, you need to probe further and try to figure out what's causing this dissatisfaction and what is causing this conflict between teams. Many students, what they often do is they say, the problem of the case is there's a lack of communication. Oftentimes, a lack of communication is simply a symptom. You need to figure out, why are they not talking to each other? What is the root cause of this lack of communication? So again, you keep asking those questions until you identify the underlying reason. So an example of an underlying reason is a complacent culture. So a complacent culture means that the employees don't feel a need for change. They feel everything is okay. They feel they're doing a great job. When in actuality, some outsiders might see that they could do better. So that's an example of a underlying reason. Another example is that some leaders have some actions, some strategies that they implement, but they don't know that there is a bad effect, a negative effect of these actions that they're doing. Okay. So a good tool to use when you're analyzing a situation is what we call the open systems model. So the open systems model is imagine that an organization is like an organism or a living thing, like a person. And in any person, a person uses inputs. So he uses, for example, food. What else? He uses relationships as part of his input. And a person or an organism transforms all these inputs into an outcome or an output. So he could be working, and that's an output. Waste is an output. So everything that happens within the organism is what we call subsystems. So little systems within an organism, for example, a digestive system, a respiratory system, what else? A endocrinological system, for example, that releases hormones, etc. So all of this form part of the entire organism. So if this is an organization, the inputs would be raw materials, human resources, information, financial capital, for example. All of these are inputs, and an organization transforms those inputs using these smaller subsystems into an output. So an output might be, of course, profit, revenue, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction. But of course, even an organization has some waste. So environmental waste is an example of that. So we use, and by the way, the environment also affects the organization greatly. So things that are happening within the environment, such as competition, the economy, all of that affect the organization or the organism. So we use this model because we know that each subsystem is connected to another subsystem. So just like a human being, you have a digestive system, but that does help. That's connected somehow to the circulation system. That creates the digestive system transforms food into energy, and energy is used for different parts in the body, including your circulation system and your breathing or your respiratory system. So all of that's connected. You take one system away, and it affects another system. I can imagine that if you take away the respiratory system, eventually the whole body will die. So in an organization, it's the same thing. We have little subsystems, for example, the sales group. You've got the finance group. You've got the research and development group. All of these little groups will talk to each other and they basically coordinate with each other. And when something is wrong with one subsystem, it can affect other subsystems. So we use this model to basically have a look when we have a symptom, we see where is that coming from, what subsystem is causing that symptom or is experiencing that system, and we try to analyze what these other subsystems are they being affected, or are they in fact the source of this problem. Okay, so when we do a diagnosis, as I said earlier, we need to collect that data. So you cannot just reach an analysis or a conclusion based on simple gut feel. So an OD consultant, when he is brought into the organization to have a look at the systems, he might do several methods to try to collect as much data as he can. One such way is through a survey questionnaire. So he may create a questionnaire which basically asks employees, how are they feeling? Why do you think they are not being productive, for example, if that's the initial finding. And then that questionnaire could be an anonymous questionnaire so that the employee doesn't identify himself. One example of a questionnaire is the student survey that we often give to our students here in school. Towards the middle of the term, you might receive a survey which basically rates the content of the unit that you're taking and also the teacher. So we use that kind of data to figure out whether our students are satisfied or whether they feel good about the situation, or whether they're encountering some problems, etc. And we use that data again to identify if we have a problem, and of course come up with solutions. Interviews can be done as well, wherein the OD consultant might be meeting with employees individually or as a group to ask them some questions. And then we also have what we call observations, and then that's the next slide basically. So observations are a more direct way of collecting data. And what we do here is we observe organizational behaviors in their actual setting. So an OD consultant might actually visit the organization, and if he's trying to analyze the sales group, for example, he may actually go along with the salesperson in meeting with clients, and then figure out basically, is he doing the right thing, or is there something in the way he's working that can be improved. So a lot of that is based on observation. So another method is what we call unobtrusive measure. So in this particular case, we're not necessarily having a direct observation of the processes within the organization, but instead we're looking at data. We're looking at sales reports, productivity reports. So an example of a productivity report is we look at a factory, for example, and we measure how much product is being produced in this factory based on the number of people that are in the factory. So we are assuming that hopefully, of course, that if we expand the number of people within the factory, that we're actually producing more product. But it can happen that even if you've got so much number of people, but the productivity is not going up, which means the output is not going up. So if that's the case, then we know that's a symptom, and we need to look at the further reasons why this productivity is not going up. Another example of data are records of grievances or complaints from employees. Another might be production quality. So we might be looking at the products that we produce, and if there are any quality defects within them, we can count the number of defects, which tells us if there's a lot of defects, then we know that there's something going on within the production process, and we need to intervene to try to fix that. Another very popular unobtrusive data that we use is financial performance. So If we know that our profits are not going up, maybe our expenses are too high, then that's a symptom of a larger problem. And then we need to look at basically why our expenses are too high. So unobtrusive measures are helpful in diagnosing group and individual outputs. And the good thing about it is they're free from biases. In other words, we're not looking at a person's personal feelings about a problem. When we do an interview or a questionnaire, that's usually tainted or affected by our own personal biases. Um, and when we use data from the operations of statistical data, like for example, sales reports, etc., usually that's more accepted by the members because they think of that as not a subjective piece of information, but it's more objective and therefore it's real. So statistical analysis of data being collected over time. So for example, the examination of monthly factory output, which might reveal trends in employee productivity. So in other words, if we're looking at data over a long period of time, we know whether it's going up or it's going down. And this could reveal, the trajectory of employee productivity. So we'll stop there for a moment. So after the organizational development practitioner identifies what the problem is, he might start asking the question about how are we going to solve these problems. And usually what happens is an ODE practitioner will recommend interventions. So what are interventions? So interventions are a set of sequence planned actions or events that are intended to help an organization increase its effectiveness. So in other words, these are activities, actual activities. They're not broad strategies. They're actual things that we need to do within the organization to facilitate change. So interventions can be divided into three categories. The first is an individual intervention. The next is team intervention. And of course, what we call an organization-wide intervention. So we'll go into detail with each one. So an individual OD interventions, and these are just examples of what we can do, is if we identify that there are particular individuals that need help in terms of developing better relationships with their co-employees, then you could recommend such things as sensitivity training or what we call a T group. So what this is an unstructured session where participants learn interpersonal skills and increase sensitivity to other people. So what that means is we're trying to improve their emotional intelligence so that they can be more wary, more what do you call this? More sensitive to the way they deal with other people. And because this might be the cause on why the team is not working well, because some individuals, for example, a team leader, is not getting along well with his subordinates, maybe because he's not very sensitive to the way he treats them. So a T group will help a leader, for example, realize that whatever actions he does has certain consequences and can have a negative impact on his staff. Another intervention is management training. So in particular, the manager is being given an educational opportunity to develop managerial skills and competencies if we detect that a manager or a leader needs some assistance or more personal development. Another individual intervention is role negotiation, or a structured interaction to clarify and negotiate role expectations among people who work together. So in other words, the people within a team might explore what exactly is the role within the team and what's their job description and how does that interact with other people. So what some interventions do is they examine the actions of each person within the team, and they examine whether that action has a positive or a negative effect on the other members of the team. That kind of awareness will help an employee realize that the things that he does may have again an impact on other people within the team. So if you want them to work better together, they should be more sensitive to that interaction within the team. So that's an example of role negotiation. Other examples of individual OD interventions include fixing the job or redesigning the job to realign the task components to better fit the needs and capabilities of the individual. So this individual may be very poor at, for example, maths, and maybe part of his role is to do a better job in math skills to be able to make a proper analysis. So if he's not very good at that kind of a duty, maybe you can take that task away from him and give it to somebody who is better suited for that kind of a task. So another intervention might be career planning, structured advice and discussion sessions to help individuals plan their career paths within the company, and give them programs to develop themselves, to improve their personal development, so that they can progress within the company. So there are also interventions that involve the entire team, and one of them is called team building. And we'll go into more detail about what team building is all about in the near future. But in a nutshell, these are structured experiences to help team members set goals, improve their interpersonal relationships, and become a better functioning team. Another is a process consultation, where you get a third party to observe what's going on within the team. This could be an OD consultant as well. And that person might have a look at the way communication is done, what causes a conflict, is the conflict handled well, and basically how are the decisions made within the team. Intergroup team building is when you have two teams that work together. Maybe they coordinate each other. For example, the finance team might have to coordinate with the sales team. And so the team might be doing quite well within the sales team, might be doing, their relationship is very good, they work well together. But if they don't necessarily work well with the finance team, then you might have a need for an intergroup team building, where you bring those two teams together and examine how they work together. And basically, again, some sensitivity training to figure out how do we work better together, these two teams. So the third category of interventions is what we call organization-wide intervention. So this time we're looking at the entire organization, where we can use, again, surveys, and we look at the feedback from employees about the entire organization. And we collect, like a student survey or an employee survey to figure out what their attitudes and their needs are. And we can use these results to plan for a better action or a solution. Confrontation meetings are one-day intensive structured meetings to gather data on workplace problems and plan for constructive action. So as opposed to a survey can be done at the employee's time, they can do it anonymously. This time, a confrontation meeting is an actual group meeting where a back and forth discussion is held among the members of the team or the members of the entire organization. Structural redesign is realigning the organizational structure. And the next session actually will delve into more detail about this. And performance management. So performance management, another word for this is management by objective, so MBO. And in this particular intervention, we formalize the way the organization works, and we link individual, group, and organizational objectives together. And then we try to figure out how each one helps another. So each person would have a set of objectives that that person has to, or that employee has to achieve in order to contribute to the higher organizational needs. So how do we know if an intervention is effective? So you basically ask these questions. Did the intervention fit the needs of the organization? So if the need of the organization is to improve team A and team B, the interaction between these two teams, did the intervention actually perform that function? If it didn't, for example, if you suggest a team building among individual teams, but you don't have an intergroup team building, then obviously your intervention was not successful. It did not address the needs of the organization. Did it address the root cause of the problems? Okay, so we know that is it solving a symptom? For example, the problem might have something to do with the quality of the product, and that's a symptom. And I mean, you might say, okay, let's do an intervention that improves the quality of the product, but that quality of the poor quality of the product might have something to do with a poor coordination between teams. And if you didn't really address that root cause, then you're not solving the problem. Will the intervention result in the intended outcome? So, for example, you can do team building. Will it improve the relationship within the team? Then that's a big question mark. You can get them to come together and try to get their relationships to improve, but it may not be successful. So you need to measure whether, in fact, this intervention resulted in better relationships within the team. Does it transfer competence to manage change to organization members? So in other words, the OD consultants, one of the goals of an OD consultant when he comes in, especially if it's an external person, his goal would be to declare himself redundant. So after a while, he should be able to come in there and teach other people how to manage change so that he or she can leave the organization, and whatever changes that were made are actually sustainable, something that can continue over time, even if the OD consultant has left the organization. So here's a good way to have a look at all these interventions that we've talked about. And we try to divide these interventions, or change activities, in other words, into 5 different stages, or 5 different broad objectives. The first is motivating change. So an intervention to motivate change would mean, for example, in the ProSci-ADKAR model, we look at the first 2 stages, which is awareness and desire. So what we're trying to do in this stage is get people to have that desire to actually change, to realize that there is a problem with the way they are behaving, the way they are performing, and to realize that they have to make that change. So that's, in other words, that's motivation to change. So we can do this by, again, having T groups, process consultations, confrontation meetings that bring out the problem out in the open. We can create a culture that is ready to change. So a culture that is continually changing is one way we can develop that motivation. So we have a culture, an organizational culture, where we're always continually diagnosing what the problems are and figuring out solutions to them. Another is stressing the values of the organization. So if we value excellence, or if we value commitment to a cause, or commitment to an objective, then we need to have workshops within the organization that develop that set of values. So team buildings can also be done to help build culture, and also group discussions. A third set of activities might be, if there is resistance to change, how do we get over this resistance to change? And we can do this in all sorts of ways. One is through a T group or sensitivity training, or a redesign of a job if we know that the person does not have the ability to do the job, then we can redesign the job so that he doesn't have to do the task. The second broad category for interventions is creating a vision. So this is the second stage. So after you have created that desire for them to change, then we try to figure out what is the goal that we want to create. We should try to dream of how the organization would look, the ideal organization, if we are successful. How would that look? How do teams interact with each other in an ideal situation? So we have visioning workshops, planning workshops, again, confrontation meetings, all of this in a way to come up with a desired future state. So in other words, what our organization would look like after we implement this change. And that sort of helps energize commitment. We get people to dream of, okay, this is what we are aiming for, and this is what we want to become. So, we should be working together towards that common goal. The third stage is developing political support. So at this stage, the OD consultant is trying to get allies. He's trying to find other people within the organization to help him or her create the change, knowing that if we're a change agent, oftentimes, or if we're the OD consultant, oftentimes we can't do it alone, or perhaps we don't have the same amount of respect within the organization, especially if we're an external person, we're coming in, people don't know us. They're not necessarily going to follow whatever we're asking them to do. So what you try to do is identify power brokers within the organization. So these people are the well-respected employees who are you can gain them on your side to help you implement the change. So this is an example of what we call a change agent. An example of this is a few sessions ago, we had this case study called ACME, wherein the OD consultant was able to get a well-respected individual within the company to help her implement the change. And it was that was a big part of why they were successful, is because she had that stakeholder, that employee, a very well-respected, many years in the organization, who basically helped her get the employees together to do team building, etc. So if you don't have that person, and in fact, the case study goes on, when she tried to implement that same set of interventions within another organization, she was unsuccessful. And the chief reason why is because she did not have a change agent who's well respected, who could help her implement these things. So we use agents to influence stakeholders. But aside from that, we have to realize that if these are our agents or our people that are helping us, we need to make sure they're well supported. Okay, so you don't want them to lose hope. You want them to continue to support us. So we should build a professional network of similar kinds of people who build on each other and support each other. So the next stage is activities that manage the change transition. You'll notice, by the way, that this basically follows Lewin's original model, the unfreeze part. The unfreeze part of Lewin's model would be activities that motivate change and creating that vision. And when we are moving into a movement stage, which is the second stage of Lewin, this is where we try to get political support to help us, and we manage that transition. And then later on, we have a third stage, which is the refreeze stage, which is the next stage for this set of interventions. So within this intervention, this is when we set goals within each team. and try to get people to be committed to those goals. So we might have a broad goal, which is the vision for the organization, but goal setting would go down the line from the main goal of the organization into a goal for each department. And we try to get commitment from within the members of that team. A very important part of managing the transition is actually having a plan for the activities that we plan to do. So a roadmap is very important. And in your assignments, in fact, this is one of the main things that we will be looking for at the end of the unit. When you do a change management plan, you must have a list of activities that you plan to do, and when are you going to do that? And that is basically an activity plan. Another word for that would be a Gantt chart or a timetable. Among the things that you might need to develop ability and to develop knowledge is training and development. Another thing that you might have to do within the transition is reorganize the company or the organization so that it better works within the environment. So that could be a reallocation of key roles and responsibilities. And during that transition, we try to monitor whether we're actually moving, we're actually, if the interventions we are proposing are actually working out. Okay, this last stage, again, is synonymous with Lewin's refreeze. This is where we try to have all the changes that we've done, and we're trying to make sure that this has become a habit, and that they go on, it becomes a sustainable change, even when the OD consultant has left. Is basically the change has been cemented into the organization. So for that, of course, we need to have resources. So that includes things like money or the budget to be able to continue with this change. Again, a support system for change agents, so that continues, so that we can ensure that the change agents are continuing to support this change that we've already set up. The performance management system really comes into play in this particular stage, because we are using the system, we are trying to monitor the performance of each individual teams, and we're trying to figure out whether they're actually performing, and whether they've actually implemented the changes, and whether the changes are actually working to improve the organization. Part of that system is rewarding and reinforcing these correct behaviors that we've set up. So if the team is in fact working well, and the team relationships have improved, then it's right to give a reward to this team. And a reward might be as simple as, okay, let's have a day out where we bring the entire team out for a beach party, or even a drinking session, or what have you, to try to reward that great behavior, great outcomes from that team. Those that are not performing well, or actually those who are even performing well, but they might need some additional feedback. That's all part of the performance management system. And then after we collect all this data and we figure out whether we're doing well and whether we can still improve, then we use that data to adjust our plans and strategies into the future. So this is all part of the action research model, if you think about it, wherein we gather data again to figure out whether we're doing well, and we use that data to adjust our future plans and adjust our change program. Another important activity that can help us sustain the momentum of change is an organizational learning and knowledge management system. So we'll discuss this in a future date, but this is what we mean by creating a culture within the organization where we're continuously learning, and we're using knowledge and sharing that knowledge among employees. So at the end of the day, if we evaluate our OD interventions, how do we know whether we've done a good job? Certainly, we have to look at the way we've implemented, and we have to evaluate how the effect of these interventions using feedback from employees. Measurement is quite important. If the intervention was meant to improve productivity, for example, within an organization, then we need to have measures to actually to tell us whether the productivity has improved or not. So it might be a factory output. So, you know, an example of this is a factory has to come out with 1,000 cars. And if our intervention is designed to increase our production by, say, 10%, that means ideally our output should be 1,100 cars to increase for that 10% increase. Are these interventions institutionalized? So in other words, are the interventions now part of the institution where we do it as part of a habit, even again without the intervention from an ODE practitioner? So are we doing this on our own? And that would be an example of institutionalizing an intervention. So an example of evaluating interventions is again to measure the outcomes of a team building activity. So if the outcome, the expected outcome was to improve relationships and to improve team output, then you should be measuring how much output the team is actually coming out with. So you can compare a before and after situation and figure out whether our team building activity has actually improved you know, the output of the team. Okay, so that's the end of our mini lecture for today. And stay tuned because we might have some future activities with your lecturer today.